Okay, good afternoon. Let's begin the session. This should be the first event that we begin on time. We need to learn with our colleagues from the United States this kind of things. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to another session of our Global Insights Local Impact series. The purpose of this initiative is to exchange knowledge, perspectives, and expertise across the global CFA community. Today's event is organized in partnership with CFA Society Atlanta. I would like to extend a special thank you to CFA Society Atlanta and special to Katie Ford for making this collaboration possible. Katie, if you want to say something.
Yes, thanks so much, Pedro, again for the opportunity to partner with CFA Society Portugal, yourself and your team on today's webinar with Mike Blake. And good afternoon from Atlanta. Thank you for having us.
Okay, thank you so much, Katie. So, our speaker today it's Mike Black. Mike it's an American who lives in Portugal in a small town of Caldas da Rainha. I ask how an American find this city in the middle of Portugal. Previously, he comes from Atlanta. He is a consultant and the and owner of I Squared Strategies. Today's topic is how to sustain a multi-generational business. And Mike, thank you so much for being with us today. The floor is yours.
Ok, thank you, Pedro, and boa tarde a todos. Obrigado por ajudar-nos conosco for this presentation. I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to present to my new home society in Portugal and to my old home society in Atlanta. We have a lot to go through today, so I'm going to ask people to hold their questions to the end. Otherwise, we'll have no chance of getting through this. But I hope that you'll find this material as informative to listen to as it was for me to create it. There we go. So, as CFA charter holders, candidates, and friends, you know that we are always beholden to something called learning outcome statements. It's how we studied for our charters, and it's sort of part of the CFA DNA, if you will. But we want to. The goal here is to. I want to offer an explanation as to why family fortunes either endure or fail to endure across generations. We're going to go through a couple of transgenerational family case studies and see what lessons we can pull from those. I'm going to share with you kind of my favorite governance tool that serves as a very useful methodology for giving family businesses the best chance to succeed over the very long term. And I want to emphasize that risk management is really the name of the game when it comes to managing transgenerational family businesses. So I have a standard set of disclaimers. I may not need to use them anymore now that I'm in Portugal, but they're probably a good idea anyway. Um, this is one person's opinion. I happen to think it's a topic that I know something about, but it may or may not reflect everybody's view, everybody's reality in everybody's case. The views expressed in this presentation are mine. They are not those of the CFA societies of Atlanta or Portugal. Importantly, nothing in here is an investment recommendation. As CFA charter holders, we understand we don't want to be in that role. And finally, as a bonus to everybody, if you find any spelling, grammar, or math mistakes, you may keep them at no extra charge. And that's a bonus gift from me to you. I came to this project from a study that I did about a decade ago, or started about a decade ago, researching the backgrounds and outcomes of about 80 transgenerational family businesses in North America, Asia, and Europe. There was a little bit in South America too, but most of those three continents. And that data set was narrowed down to, or study set was narrowed down to 48, simply due to availability of data. Many of these companies are privately held, and so finding the needed information about them can be easier in some cases than others. But even though I would not consider this a statistically significant study, and I'm certainly not making that representation, there are themes that have emerged that I think seem linked to transgenerational success and failure. So those are the lessons that we're going to cover today. Oops. Admit that person, and then I can do this. Good. So as an overview of how we're going to proceed today, we kind of have four movements, if you will. An overview of what the data tells us, why family fortunes survive or don't survive, some case studies, the importance of governance, and then how do we take this as CFA charter holders and put it to use as value-added advisors, either outside the transgenerational business, and this includes family offices, by the way, or inside the business. Some of us may be working as a chief investment officer or an investment analyst, chief financial officer inside the family business. And if you are in that role, the chances are very good that the family or the business relies on you for counsel. Um, and there's a central theme that I think is really important. And candidly, in the interest of kind of talking about the bottom line up top, if there's one point you take away from today, um, it's that the families that stay wealthy over a long period of time, and I mean decades to centuries, their focus is on creating wealth, not simply preserving it. That, in other words, they adopt a growth posture rather than a wealth preservation posture. And for the math types that are watching this, I'm going to go through some math or at least some data that's going to help understand why this is true. It's not simply because of a it's not simply because of a theoretical or ideological basis, but it's really the numbers that talk about this. And it's important to understand the difference between risk avoidance and risk management. Risk management is a winning activity for almost every business. Risk avoidance is often mistaken for risk management, but in fact, risk avoidance is not risk management at all. It's simply trying to hide from risk. And anytime you try to hide from something that's really not managing it, it's hoping it doesn't find you. Now, there is a common belief, and this comes from a number of sources. I've where possible throughout this presentation, I've cited sources that you can look up on your own. And to be perfectly candid, not everybody believes that these numbers are exactly right, but there is an attrition rate between businesses that are started today versus the ones that will exist in a generation, two generations, three generations, and so forth. And in the United States, we call this the shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves phenomenon. That if wealth is built in one generation, then it is likely that by the third, and certainly, or very likely by the fourth generation, that wealth will be gone. It will have been dissipated, spent, squandered, destroyed. Something has happened to it along the way. Because, and I would argue because the family made some avoidable bad decisions that made the business vulnerable to that kind of value destruction. And one of the reasons that this occurs, again, is simple math. We'll talk about we'll talk about the the mechanics of wealth preservation across generations. But even before you get to that kind of deeper analysis, and even if you don't believe it, the one fact that is simple to understand and irrefutable is that as a family ages over generations, there are going to be more members of that family. If that doesn't happen, generally speaking, you don't have a family anymore. And it's kind of interesting. You actually see this throughout history. I argue one of the greatest failed succession stories in history was the fate of the Frankish Empire after the death of Charlemagne and his son Luther, or Lothair, as he would have been called in French. Up until then, the territory that is known as France and Germany was all unified, more or less unified, under the Frankish kingdom. And indeed, it is widely believed that the language that Charlemagne spoke and his direct heirs more closely resembled German than it did French or Latin. Somewhere there's some Frenchmen right now that are very angry at that statement, but don't blame me. It's the historical linguists that say that. Um, but over time, and I forget exactly when this was in history, but the kingdom was inherited by three sons, was split into three. Two of them became modern France, and another one became modern Germany. And as a result of that divide, or one of the results of that divide, was that they became eventually modern day France, modern day Germany, with two distinct cultures, and of course, up until about 80 years ago, with a history of devastating and very destructive conflict. Um, Now, of course, where family businesses are concerned, this is not how we expect it's going to work. We don't think that a family business is going to destroy Europe if it collapses. But it is illustrative that even where businesses are not concerned, where it's kingdoms, countries, anytime that you have an asset whose ownership has to be split among heirs, it creates a tension in the fabric of that business, of that entity, of that asset that is going to very likely cause it to be torn apart. And what happens when you have that tearing, or that tearing apart, or that tearing phenomenon, is two things. One, you have the potential for creating conflict. And a great business example of this is the Lidl and Aldi empires. You may or may not know this, but Lidl and Aldi used to be owned by the same family. But in the 1950s, two brothers decided they couldn't get along. They split it. One of them took the south of Germany, the other one took the north. I forget which one is which. I want to say Aldi took the south, but I could be mistaken. Somebody can look that up. And now they're two separate stores, but if you're wondering why the two stores exist but they look so familiar, that's why. They're still owned by related branches of the same family. Um, the other reason that this conflict is so destructive is, economies of scale matter, and it matters where wealth is concerned. Um, we can all appreciate that the investment opportunities that are available to us if we have 50,000 euros in the bank are different from the investment opportunities we have if we have 500,000 euros in the bank, 5 million euros, or 50 million euros, or even a half a billion euros. And not only the kinds of investment opportunities, but also the risk management resources that we have available. And so there is ample evidence to suggest that there is strength in numbers. And so the extent to which the family business can remain a cohesive economic entity as well as a social entity, and make no mistake, families are important economic entities, the more likely it is that the family will be successful over a large number of generations from an economic standpoint. And so, the other force at play here is our old friend inflation. If we simply apply a relatively modest pace of inflation, and most of the people on this call, I think, know this, but nevertheless, it's worth visiting because it's such an important force. If you do nothing, if you make no return, even if you have no expenses, the purchasing power of the assets that you have 30 years from now are going to be worth significantly less than what they are worth today. And again, that not only is that math, but we all know it makes common sense. Both Europe and North America have experienced higher rates of inflation than we have been used to seeing for at least a generation. I'm old enough to remember the stagflation period of the 1970s. I had a certificate of deposit that was 18%. But that's only because inflation in the United States at that time was about 15%. That was the only way the banks could attract deposits. We're nowhere near that, but nevertheless, given a sufficiently long time horizon, inflation inflation takes its bite. Now, here's where some of the math starts to come in. The one of the goals and one of the goals to maintain the family cohesion and commitment to the economic unit that is the wealth generation engine of that family is its ability to maintain a pace of value creation such that when dilutive events happen, in this case, more people being born, frankly, having babies. And I'm not saying don't have babies. I'm just pointing out the math that the more descendants that you have, and it inevitably is going to happen over time, and they tend to multiply, the greater is the burden on the company to generate wealth so that by sheer virtue of increasing the denominator, that is the number of family members that are going to have some claim on the wealth of the family business, the greater the burden is on the company that um, to maintain the level of wealth so that the appearance of new generations doesn't become a dilutive event. And so we can see that, as we increase the number of generations, we still have to have a fairly high return, certainly a higher return than is realistic and this is where the risk part comes in, the risk management part comes in, than it is realistic in a minimal risk, no risk posture from an investment perspective. You're just not going to get 6, 7, 8% annual rate of return by investing in treasuries and bank certificates of deposit, money market funds. If you do that, that's fine, but over time, the wealth, the value of the family enterprise will simply be so diluted that it will dissipate into nothing. And by the way, and we're going to get into this very shortly, I think the next slide actually, this doesn't even factor in the cost of maintaining the wealth. I don't work for free. I imagine nobody else on this call does. And whether you're an external wealth advisor or you're an internal investment officer or analyst, the family office or the family business has to generate enough income to pay you for your expertise and your management efforts. So if you work through the math, you over 4 generations, it works through that you have to multiply your wealth by about 50x, 50 times over the course of a century just to hold per capita wealth constant. Um, that's a big number, and I understand it's over the course of 100 years, but and 100 years is a long time, and most of us are not going to live to see that 100-year time horizon. But it gives you a sense as to the enormity and the gravity of the task that falls before the advisor, the wealth manager, the chief executive officer, or the executive team of the family business. And this is before incorporating or considering taxes, distributions, philanthropy. Philanthropy can be a big one. Some of you may be aware of the Vanderbilt family, which was one of the original robber baron families, if you will, of the United States. They made their fortune by operating barges across the East River and Hudson River that run alongside the island of Manhattan in what is now, and then as well, what is New York City. And interestingly enough, they did so by undercutting fares of their competitors at the expense of safety. So they were known as being very dangerous. And as a result, the first heir of the Vanderbilt family fortune was actually known as Commodore Vanderbilt. Commodore in English means a captain who is in charge of a fleet of ships, but does not hold the rank of admiral. And fun fact to this day, the name of the sports teams that play for Vanderbilt University in the state of Tennessee are still to this day known as the Vanderbilt Commodores, and that's why. But after the second generation, they the heirs devoted most of their activities to philanthropy, including creating the Vanderbilt University, but also founding many libraries, museums, and so forth. And that was great, except for one problem. They forgot to make money. And so by the time the fourth generation rolled around, they had gone from short sleeves to short sleeve. They simply spent everything. You can visit some of their old mansions. I think one still exists in Manhattan, but they're most famous for building exorbitant and luxurious mansions in a place called Rhode Island, not far from where I grew up in Boston, and you can still take tours today. But Gloria Vanderbilt, who is the fifth generation Vanderbilt, uh, and and has a fortune in her own right from fashion, she had to do it the old-fashioned way. There was no family nest egg waiting for her. Um, and one of the more famous Vanderbilts now is a guy by the name of Anderson Cooper, who's had a long career as a journalist and news anchor on CNN and other news outlets in the United States. And as he is fond of saying, there is no family fortune waiting for me. I've had to earn it the old-fashioned way. But they overspent on philanthropy, so they sort of didn't keep their eyes on what would generate wealth to keep the philanthropic efforts going. So once we get into maintenance, now we need to add even more return. So if you have sort of a low overhead business or family office, you would typically be expecting, something of having to spend 1.5% of your net assets on maintaining the family office and conducting its operations. A more moderate, maybe more common ratio might be 3.5%. And if you have a particularly high load, maybe you're a relatively small family office, but you're still deciding you want to maintain that infrastructure proprietary, then it's 6.5% of your net assets. So this is on top of the returns that you have to create in order to maintain wealth per generation, right? So add these to the numbers in the far right column, and now we're talking about returns in the 10 to 15% range, and that goes beyond, well beyond what we would expect from the returns that you would get from a diversified equity portfolio, such as the S&P 500. So this highlights the immense financial challenge of sustaining a transgenerational business. And so, here's a kind of a couple of examples of what those returns look like. If you sort of have what we call a low friction family, where you have relatively low expenses, you're extraordinarily well run, extraordinarily efficient, you still need a hurdle rate of about a little bit over 9%. Over time, that might be doable with a diversified stock portfolio, S&P 500. The general historical returns have been between 8 and 10%. But you better hope that no significant shock occurs. Once you get to moderate and high friction families, you cannot simply rely upon your stock portfolio generating the return that is necessary to sustain the family business, whether that's a family office or whether it's an operating business. Which means that the transgenerational family business has three what I call family levers. And of course, one thing that you can do is you can raise returns. And that's the fun part of being a financial analyst. Um, that's what gets you on the cover of Fortune magazine or the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal. If you're the person that can consistently beat the market, it's the sexy part of the profession. Decidedly less sexy, but certainly important is reducing friction. And in discussing friction, I'm going to add now non-financial, non-tangible elements, including conflict between family members, mistrust. Families can waste tremendous amounts of wealth simply over with infighting and hiring lawyers to take out their frustrations on one another. And when that happens, the lawyers and the accountants get rich, but nobody in the family does. Um, and then the final lever, also not sexy, but I would argue is the most important lever of all, is to manage risk. Looks like our subtitles have gone away. I'm going to pause for a minute and see if I can get them back again. Okay. All right. Looks like they're coming back. Um, Three families, I think, they happen to be European families, I think serve as good case studies to illustrate the importance of a growth orientation. Um, it's very tempting as an heir to focus on preservation, overly focus on preservation. But the problem is if you believe the numbers that I've presented today, if you adopt a risk minimization posture, you're simply not going to generate enough value in the company over time to sustain the value, even if you do everything else right. The returns just simply are not there. So we're going to take three different families from three different countries and really sort of three different cultural traditions within Europe. We've got the Wallenbergs from Sweden. We've got the Mouillet family from France, and the Agnelli family from Italy. Now, the Wallenberg family, if you're not familiar with them, is lies at the heart of Swedish industrialization. And their flagship company called Investor AB is effectively Sweden's Berkshire Hathaway, previously run by Warren Buffett until he retired at the end of last year. Uh, Candidly, a good chunk of the Swedish economy has been or is under the control in some way of the Wallenberg and the Wallenberg family. And you can read here, I'm not going to just read line item by line item. You can do that, but the portfolio consists of names that you know whether you're Swedish or not. We all know Ericsson, we all know ABB, Saab, and so forth. Um, they govern themselves through a series of nonprofit foundations. And my sense is this is because of Sweden's fairly heavy tax burden. So moving things into nonprofit can make a lot of sense. But they have a culture that includes an expectation that the goal of each new generation is not to simply hold serve, is not to simply hold where you are, but rather grow, build upon what the prior generation had done because they've seen the same numbers I've shown you, that simply holding where you are, simply treading water is a losing proposition. It will take you a long time to lose, but you will lose because the math is simply not working in your favor. But this notion of a family office operating like private equity with a 100-year horizon gives the Wallenbergs and other family offices a tremendous advantage. One that, by the way, Berkshire Hathaway enjoyed. You know, Warren Buffett didn't like to sell companies. He was not a flipper. He wanted to buy companies. He was so focused on value. His acquisition thesis was always, is this a company that we want to own 10 or 20 years from now? And if they didn't answer that question in the affirmative, then they simply wouldn't make that purchase. And that was one of the strengths of their particular discipline. You compare that to the typical family, if you compare that to the typical private equity fund that has at most a 10-year horizon, the model forces liquidations of holdings prematurely. And although private equity managers are trying to find companies that they can buy and then flip at a high rate of return in 5, 7 years, um, it doesn't always work out that way. But they can still be very viable, attractive, resilient companies that simply need longer to incubate. And having a 10-year time horizon even, or a 20-year time horizon ideally, or the luxury of a 100-year horizon gives you the chance to generate much higher risk-adjusted returns than than if you have and are compelled or limited by a shorter time horizon. And this is just a little bit of a timeline of how the Wallenbergs have operated. And in 1856, they were founded by Enskilda Bank. Now that's called SEB. I think the S stands for Svenska, Swedish. Anyway, the fact that it's a bank, the fact that it's a financial institution is not an accident. And we're going to come back to that in the next 20 minutes or so. Now, if you look at the continuum of the nature of their investments, they built infrastructure companies, telecom, for example. And then they moved into international expansion. They took advantage of the fact that they were neutral during the Second World War, at least nominally so. Um, and then with the advent of what we would consider modern technology, the family moved along with it. They didn't resist it. They didn't fight it. They went along with it, and now they're investing heavily in artificial intelligence and biotechnology, deep tech, and so forth. And they're one of the reasons that, in spite of kind of how the what many would characterize as an economy structured against capital, if you will, Sweden has one of the strongest tech sectors in Europe, and probably the strongest if you think on a per capita basis. The Mouillet family is one that you're either familiar with directly or indirectly. If you've been to an Auchan, if you've been to a Decathlon or Leroy Merlin, um, you've been a customer of the Mouillet family. Um, they appeared shortly after World War II, and you'll see that they don't focus on just one thing. They're constantly expanding. They're diversifying, and as you can see, they have nearly 1,000 shareholders within a family of 1,650 family members. And note that not every family member is a shareholder. You have to kind of earn your place within the shareholder ranks. Um, but one of the benefits that this family structure provides is venture capital, if you will. Europe is not an easy place to fund a business. Really, most places aren't, unless you're in two or three places in the United States. Um, but family offices and family portfolios like this have become that source for risk capital. And you'll notice that they encourage entrepreneurship. The goal again is not to just hang on to what you have, but to take risks, find that new business, find that new product, that new technology. Yes, most of them are going to fail or at least not achieve exciting returns. But if you're investing over a 100-year period, you're going to have some hits, and they're going to either join or they're going to replace some of the keystone value generators of the business. So they're no longer a single retailer, but the family business itself is now its own ecosystem. And you can see here a timeline of how they've expanded into different businesses, and they really kind of, I think, did their pivot in the 2000s, and now they're a provider of capital and innovation. The Agnelli family made their money making Fiats, the cars that are very popular here in Europe. Of course, they exist in North America, but they're not that popular. Americans are big. We have a hard time fitting into them. Um, but they've realized over time that not only do they need to diversify, but there's an important lesson to take from them, that they're willing to get out of businesses that no longer fit their portfolio. So to me, the lesson that I want to share here is not so much what they've done, although that is useful, um, but what they've gotten out of. They've been willing to cut out major businesses over time. Whether it's in the aviation business or the railroad business, or Cushman and Wakefield, which is a commercial real estate tenant representation business. Even getting out of a football club. Um, And many families that have failed, such as the Stroh family in the United States, they were a beer family. They never diversified beyond beer, and that was one of the things that contributed to the downfall of their family business after 100 years. They simply failed to adapt. And so I think it's important to take the lesson from them that once they'd established themselves as a car company, they then realized that they became a capital allocator. Now they could have reinvested in fiat, and I'm sure that they did to some extent, but they also realized that as good a business as the car business is, that was a very risky thing to do to put all their eggs into one basket. They needed to diversify. And so even though they made their name in the automobile business, they are now heavily involved in many industries that you may not even be aware that they are involved in that, but that's okay. They're not doing it for the publicity. They're doing it because that's what they need to do to survive and generate the risk-adjusted returns over time in order to sustain the business and not be dilutive. So if we look at these businesses side by side, we notice some common themes. They all diversify, right? They manage risk. That doesn't mean that they retrench. Again, they're not risk minimizing, they're risk managing. They all have a reinvestment, which means a growth culture. And the family business does not exist simply to be a source of dividends so that the heirs can take expensive vacations, buy expensive real estate, and take luxurious trips. They all are willing to reinvent themselves. And as we're going to get into, they all have a very high level of governance sophistication because you have to, once you get beyond even five or six people, the problem with human beings, they start to act like human beings. And human beings are greedy unless they are able to restrain themselves. And human beings want instant gratification, but they have to restrain themselves exceptionally in order to accept delayed gratification. And in order to do that, in order to put those guardrails up, sophisticated governance is required. So we think of families that are decades old, even centuries old in terms of their businesses, and we think they must be great wealth preservers. And perhaps they are, but more importantly, they're able to preserve wealth because they're able to create it. They don't they don't just wait or they don't just sit around and wait for opportunities to come to them. They don't just wait for the time to come when they draw down their wealth and then try to figure things out. They have it built into their DNA to to continue to grow because they simply have to. The math leaves them no alternative. So we've talked about growth and we've talked about risk and risk management. The third lever for a successful transgenerational family business is governance. And insurance companies have a lot to teach us. Um, most of the very old companies that still exist today that you can think of are actually insurance companies. And I call these meat and potatoes companies. They're not sexy, but all they do is they make money. And of course, they're great. They're exceptional risk managers because that's what the insurance business is. It's risk management. Um, and these businesses have survived wars, natural catastrophes, plague, social upheaval. The Philadelphia Contributorship, founded by Benjamin Franklin, survived the American Revolution. It was founded in one country, domiciled in one country, wound up being domiciled in an entirely different one. And I think the tool of choice needs to be to put together what's called a family constitution. And a family constitution is a written document in the form of an agreement, but it's more than that. It's more than an agreement. It's a manifesto. It's an expression of philosophy that establishes how a family is going to make decisions and how it balances the interests of the current generation versus future generations, including generations that have not been born yet. And a family constitution directly addresses the two largest drivers of wealth destruction. First is trust and communication. Um, Family infighting is devastating. Um, and as I mentioned before, the only people who get rich from family conflict are lawyers and accountants. And I guess I could add the third, the occasional therapist may get rich from that, but nobody in the company ever does. And the best run, the most resilient transgenerational family businesses are exceptional at building trust and over communicating, which I think actually touches on the second point, which is preparing heirs. And a family that is exceptional at this, that's probably the best at doing it, is the Mars family, the American company that started off in candy, M&Ms, Mars bars, etc. But now, by the way, does a lot of business in the veterinary technology space, dog and cat food, things of that nature. So, even they're diversifying. But the Mars are they're reputed, I've never met them, but they're reputed to be almost cult-like in the way that they prepare future generations to take over the business. There's an indoctrination uh, process that takes place over the first couple of decades of a child's and young adult's life that prepares them to lead the business into whatever generation they happen to fall in. The data shows that the biggest causes of wealth dissipation are breakdowns in trust and communication, unprepared heirs, lack of a shared family mission, and then poor tax, legal, and financial planning. And you may be thinking to yourself, why is he talking about this? How does this relate to the financial discussion? It relates to the financial discussion because if you accept the premise that the returns required by the transgenerational business require more than simply autopilot, you cannot achieve those returns if the family is constantly infighting. You cannot achieve those returns if the people taking over the business don't know what they're doing. They cannot achieve those returns if they don't have an investment thesis to guide them. For those of you in the audience who are CFA charter holders or CFA candidates, one of the first questions we would ask a client if we were in wealth management. I'm not, but I've studied enough that I know, what are the objectives of the investor? What is the risk tolerance? And if you don't have a shared family mission, then families then tend to go to the lowest common denominator. If they can't agree, then they're going to go back and they're going to invest in T-bills and euro bonds and Swiss franc denominated securities and so forth. Because if you do anything else and it doesn't work out, you open yourself up to all kinds of legal trouble, which is fine for whoever is stewarding the business, but it's not good for the business itself and ultimately is destructive to the shareholders that are supposed to benefit from the value that the business creates and provides. And I think we can push the analogy further. if an insurance company has an underwriting manual, has procedures, capital policy, plans for catastrophes, governance manuals, then a family enterprise can have something similar. It starts with this family constitution that, as we're going to see, will include at a minimum how you're going to resolve disputes, including exiting somebody from the business. If somebody just does not want to get to the program, get with the program. If somebody just is not a fit for being in the family business, there ought to be a way to exit them fairly. A family business is not intended to be a mafia family where you're trapped for the rest of your life and you can't get out. There does need to be an exit path. And if you're wondering what a family constitution should include, well, I think it should include at a minimum these 10 items. Now, this does not mean that the Constitution has to be a lengthy document. I've seen them be very, very lengthy. The longest one I've seen is hundreds of pages in length because the family wanted it to be not just a governance document, but also an educational document, in effect, a dissertation on how to run a family business over multiple generations. But a family constitution does not have to be a lengthy document. I think if the US Constitution is maybe 20 pages, um, including, what is it, 27 amendments, I think, then a family constitution doesn't need to take more than that unless you wanted to. But this constitution serves as an overarching global risk management tool for the family business. I talked a little bit about how destructive family conflict is and how prevalent family conflict is when transgenerational businesses fail. The Constitution, just as it does in the government, is effectively a document that provides mechanisms for resolving disputes and resolving the conflicting interests of its constituents, or in the case of a business, its owners. Um, the Constitution will typically make it difficult for a family member to sell their shares to an outsider. Um, a family constitution, if done well, will shift a culture from one of entitlement to one of engagement, and one of stewardship. One of the most damaging attitudes that can take place in a transgenerational family business is the sense of the upcoming generation that they are entitled to ultimately ownership and some proceeds from the ownership of that business. And that's a that's a good concept to take issue with, to wipe out, to destroy as quickly as possible, because entitlement is just a killer. And then what is the process for providing leadership, and providing succession? Um, whether a family has a lot of wealth or not, there's going to be conflict. There's going to be a sense or sensitivities to parents favoring one child over another. There's a reason the soap operas and telenovelas exist, because those are fictitious stories, but in some ways they're reflecting real life enough. I mean, not everybody comes back from the dead and has, evil twin brothers and sisters that were really a nun hiding out in Nepal, but you get where I'm coming from. So, the Constitution can pull levers of risk and governance. And you could also argue that it can't force growth. It can help you with the investment returns, but the Constitution can't force you to grow. It can encourage risk taking. It can encourage a growth outlook and a growth posture, but it can't make you do it because a constitution cannot foresee every growth opportunity that is going to that is going to meet the company. And it cannot force the company and the company's leadership to meet the moment in that moment. But it can, at a minimum, make sure that other elements of the family business and of the family shareholder group don't impede the process toward pursuing the growth that is so necessary for the family business to survive at a transgenerational level. And it's also critical to prepare for the potential transitions that could be, if they're not handled well, they could be the asteroid that that destroys the business. And each of these multi-generational businesses have absorbed shocks. If they've been around long enough, they've survived the Great Depression. They've survived two world wars. They have survived the Cold War. They have survived natural disasters. Um, and the goal of the family constitution should be to create a framework that encourages a posture that manages for resilience. And I want to, in the time I have left, I want to talk a little bit about what resilience means. Resilience resilience means the ability not just to survive a shock, but actually be made stronger by it. And this is not my idea. This idea was promoted by Nicholas or Nassim Taleb, who wrote The Black Swan, and others. Very good books, although very difficult reads, even if you're a native English speaker. But they are worth the read. And one of the observations that he made is that the difference between an organism and a mechanism is that when presented with a shock, a mechanism depreciates and deteriorates. An organism is stronger. That's why we go to the gym and lift weights. That's why we jog. That's why we walk to work. That's the way that organisms work. And then the Constitution will enable continuity. Ideally, you should have a handover that takes place with grace, with a long time horizon, but not too long. You don't want it to be so long that it loses meaning. And you'd like there to be as much buy-in by the other shareholders as possible, but universal buy-in may not be realistic. And then you need to protect the family. You need to have not just the family constitution, but a series of other agreements, including shareholder agreements, covenants, possibly even trusts and other organizations that limit the damage that a localized family conflict can create. But the Constitution should provide the backbone for managing for resilience, to adopt a growth posture, and to always be preparing for the inevitable transitions that will be coming. So if you're a CFA charter holder or a candidate, what do you do? Well, I think when you're asked about this, I think first you have to reframe the problem a little bit. It's not first and foremost a portfolio problem, because if the governance issues aren't addressed, you won't have enough control to influence the portfolio. So the governance has to come first, which then enables you and enables the family to then take your advice on how the portfolio ought to be balanced and managed. You need to advise, the whole of the balance sheet. This is where, as a CFA charter holder, you can't just rely on what was in the exams. You can't just rely on what's in the finance textbooks. You have to become a holistic advisor. And that includes emotional intelligence as much as it does conventional intelligence. And that Constitution once created, is should be the instrument that you refer to. If you're kind of wondering what would the founders do, the Constitution should tell you that. And then, finally, as you decide how you're going to allocate capital, think like an insurer. Think about where are the exposures. You set reserves and limits and have catastrophe plans in place, not just for transitions, but for the catastrophes we all know could happen, but we have no idea when they're going to happen, what they're going to look like. None of us predicted COVID-19, and yet here it is. And something like that is going to happen again. Like so much of this, like so much of the rest of this presentation, you don't have to believe me, you just have to believe the math. So growth, not preservation, sustains fortunes. The families that have been successful show us what the path is. And again, this is not ideological. This is arithmetical. Um, you must adopt a growth posture, or it's just simply not going to work even under the best of circumstances. The good news, there are steps, there are best practices available. There are enough of these families out there, these transgenerational family businesses out there, that we can learn from what they've done right, and we can learn from what they've done wrong to adopt a series of best practices to advise these families on how to realize their goals of dynastic wealth. There are many ways, there are many tools available. I happen to focus on a family constitution, but I'm not a lawyer. A lawyer will have many other tools to use that I think should work side by side with the family constitution. Um, and then finally, if you look at the great family businesses, that they don't focus on good intentions because good intentions are fungible. They build systems. Good intentions come and go, but the right, robust, resilient systems are durable and ultimately are the value generators. So I hope I've made at least an interesting case. You may agree or not agree with everything that I've said today, but I hope we've covered the learning outcome statements that I set forth at the start of this webinar. And I know we've run a little bit over time, and I apologize for that, but I'm happy to stay and answer any questions that people may have, or even if you disagree with what I've said, I'm happy to engage in a debate, see if we can learn something. Pedro?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Michael. I don't know if there are any questions, feel free to put now or never.
Yeah. Hello, Mike and Pedro. Wonderful presentation. Thank you. Very, very insightful. I love these issues. It's quite interesting. Can you just expand on the role that you were saying that you're creating the cult issue and how you prepare the next generation? How do you prepare this generation to be stewards of the wealth? Not only I would like to explore not the risk takers, okay, the people that will go out and try to entrepreneur in new businesses, but rather the ones that are able to influence the current business to make them grow, or at least to make them successful, the current businesses. What sorts of how do you train, how do you educate these people to be stewards of their investments in companies? How to select proper managers, how to make sure that they have good governance systems, and so on. Do you have any
So
insights on that?
I have some. Others here may have others, and I encourage people to jump in if I miss something, I probably will. The Mars family is an extreme example. Again, they're rumored to be almost cult-like, that from the day you are born, you are taught the responsibility and what it's like to be in the Mars family, and you are expected to contribute. But I think a lot of families take a similar approach, even if it's not quite with that intensity. The families that want to transition or want to have a transgenerational business must do so intentionally. If you try to do it by accident, if you do it and you just hope that somebody in your family grows up and wants to be in the business and has the necessary skills, temperament, God-given talent to lead the business, then you're setting yourself up for failure because most people are not naturally cut out for that. So it starts with identifying very early who might have an interest in the business. I think one of the best practices, and this is one of the things, by the way, one of the things I love about Portugal is, during the school vacations, I see kids that are working inside the family business. There's a cafe here in Caldas Terrena I go to, and I know the owners fairly well. When their kids are not in school, they're bringing food out to the customers, or they're loading things into the refrigerator, whatever it is that they can do. And I love that. Now that's not going to be a multi-million-dollar business. I doubt that business does more than 200,000 euros a year of annual turnover. But I think bringing in that understanding at a young age of the work that is required to build that business, to sustain that business, the mindset of satisfying a customer, the work ethic. I think the earlier that you can instill that as a culture in the family, I think that's the best path. But also recognize, some people are not cut out for this. There's a very sad story of the Rothschild family. They're a very big merchant banking and investment banking concern, been around a very long time. I'm sure you've all heard of them. Um, their CEO at one point in the 1990s hanged himself in his office because he didn't want to be in that role, but the family kind of forced him. But he didn't like being, he happened to be good. He was smart enough that he could overcome the fact that he didn't like to do it. He didn't like being in the crosshairs or being in the bullseye for the rest of the family members to take shots at. And it wound up, of course, being disastrous. So, as far as, I think there is a family business institute that I think operates out of New York that has some educational programs you can actually send your kids to. No, Fox, Family Office Exchange, that's what it's called. Um, so there are some training programs, but I think it really boils down to building a culture. And even if you're not going to be involved in the business, let's say that your talent isn't playing the violin, it's not in running a business, right? So that's just sometimes the way we come out. That still means that you can be an engaged shareholder, that you should at least read the annual reports that you're being sent, that you can have enough vocabulary that you know what is going on in the company. You show up to vote, um, but also, and you don't needlessly create conflict. So I think that's a general way of approaching it that I think is the most likely to be successful.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Okay. Uh, Anyone else would like to put a question? Okay. No. So in that case, Mike, again, I will say thank you, and I will close the session. As I mentioned on the beginning, we'll record the session and will be available in your YouTube in a couple of days. Thank you so much, and good
Thank
night.
you. And thank you,
Thanks,
Mike.
everybody.